Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a regular voice on Monocle Radio. I might go so far as to add that he is my favourite contributor. He's worked as a journalist and a geopolitical risk consultant. He's lived in Miami and Moscow and now resident in London. He was a former partner at Control Risks, a global specialist risk consultancy that helps organisations succeed in a volatile world. As a fluent Russian speaker, he holds degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. His book, Zero Sum, has been described as a tour de force exploration of the rollercoaster story of Western capitalists and their misadventures in post-communist Russia, chronicling the hope, the naivety and arrogance and folly in glorious, high-readable detail. Charles Hecker, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Georgina, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It really is for me too, and it's just I'm so happy that you're here and that you've done this book, and we'll get into why I feel that way a little bit later. But let's just start with you, because you are known to our listeners. You pop up on our radio all of the time because you're an expert at so many things, Russia, but also geopolitical risk. You're really great at doing newspaper reviews for us because you are across what happens in geopolitics. I'm interested in what makes the man now that knows all this take us right back. You were born in
New York City.
Tell us more.
Right. It was 1963 and was born in New York City. Then, after a very brief period, moved to the suburbs. And this is a sort of traditional migratory route for a lot of families that start out their lives and their careers in New York City. And then ultimately moved to the suburbs, as was the case with my parents and my father in a corporate transfer. And we wound up in Stamford, Connecticut, which most people do two things. They confuse it with Stanford, the home of the university in Northern California, or they know Stamford because they usually drive through it between Boston and New York. Stanford's about 45 minutes outside of New York City in southwestern Connecticut. You can't avoid it if you're on the Amtrak or on I-95, shuttling back and forth, as people often do, between New York and Boston.
So it's you and your sister Judy.
That's right.
And your parents. What do your parents do at this point?
So my dad is a legal executive at a large corporation. It was in the 70s what you would call back then a conglomerate. It was a company that owned other companies. And he was working in the legal department. He was a lawyer that graduated number one in his class at New York University. And my mother had taken time off to raise my sister and I. She was a retail executive, and she worked at a big department store in New York City where she was a sportswear buyer. So she took some time off to raise my sister and I. And then when both of us were able to sort of feed and clothe ourselves, my mother and a group of her best girlfriends opened up a clothing boutique in Stamford. It's very funny because subsequently, many years, decades later in life, I've made a lifelong friend. We met in Moscow, in fact, and she grew up in the town next door. And when I mentioned the name of my mother's boutique, she and her mother had shopped there.
That's lovely. That's absolutely lovely. So it's sounding quite sort of middle America, suburban, quite normal upbringing. And yet out of this comes somebody who's fluent in Russian and speaks geopolitics, if you like. So I'm wondering how that part of you was forged.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was a little bit of a sort of Volvo and Golden Retriever kind of upbringing. But remember that this is at the peak of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union loomed enormously over the American consciousness. And geopolitics was never very far away. And in fact, some of my earlier childhood memories were of the 1972, I believe, energy crisis in the United States, where we would sit for hours in the car queuing up at petrol stations to top up the tank because this was the Saudi energy embargo of the United States, and it had a direct impact on everyone who had a car in the U.S. And drivers and car owners from California to Connecticut were queuing up, sometimes literally for more than an hour, just to get a few drops of petrol into their tanks. So geopolitics was massive at the time. And it was, you know, we were the kind of family that every Sunday morning there'd be a huge pile of newspapers on the kitchen table. At dinner times and at family gatherings, inevitably the conversation would turn to politics, and whether it was domestic politics or international affairs. And, the sort of magazines that came into the house and just the exposure that we had led to a certain level of curiosity about what was going on in the world around us.
Mm-hmm. So you ended up at Penn.
Yeah, that's right. So, and this is for, a lot of people that became involved in the Soviet Union and later in Russia. Their entry into the field was through the language. And that was exactly the case with me. And that is that I will never forget, it was my sophomore year, my second year at Penn, and I had a gigantic hole in my schedule and, needed to get the credits and the hours and the classroom time. And, to sort of back up half a second, when I was in Stanford and headed for high school, I was going to go to a high school that taught Russian. As it happens, we moved to another town, and that high school did not offer Russian.
Why had you been attracted to learning Russian?
I just thought it would be exotic. I thought it would be interesting. I mean, there is a tenuous family connection. I mean, on my mother's side of the family, my grandmother and grandfather are both from the Russian Empire. My grandfather grew up in a very tiny town in northern Ukraine, and my grandmother was born on the border between sort of what is now Latvia and Russia in the Russian Empire. Her birth certificate is in Old Orthography Russian, pre-revolutionary Russian. But I can't really say that it was family ties that brought me there, because I'll never forget when I finally did sign up for Russian at Penn, having, missed the opportunity to study it in high school. My grandmother looked at me and she said, "What are you studying Russian for?" We ran like hell out of there. So, that took a little bit of explaining. But like most people who get involved in this field of study, you learn the language. The language is absolutely captivating. And as often happens at universities, you have a professor that brings it all to life. And Cindy Martin, who I remember to this day, was that professor who brought everything to life. And she and another professor ran a summer school in what was then Leningrad. And so university students from all over the United States, including a small cohort of us from Penn, packed up in the summer of 1983. We got visas, we got signed up with the institute that we were studying with in Leningrad. We were also told that anybody at the time who traveled to the Soviet Union automatically had a CIA file opened up on them. And, once all of that paperwork was taken care of, we flew first to Helsinki, and then we got on a train in the Finnish capital and took the train across the border to the Soviet Union. And you get to Leningrad in 1983. It is the waning days of the Brezhnev era, and your head explodes. I mean, it is like visiting, or was like visiting, a foreign planet. Mm-hmm. You're getting to grips with the language. Then you get to grips with the food and with the culture and with the people and with getting around Leningrad and the metro and the fact that you're there in the summer and it's white nights. And so there is this mystery, intrigue, a bit of underlying hostility, because here you are, a bunch of American students in the Soviet Union. And then there's this phenomenal sort of romance. I mean, Leningrad and, subsequently now St. Petersburg is a breathtakingly beautiful city built on a swamp and built on the skeletons of the serfs who built it. But it is a breathtakingly beautiful city. And when the sun never sets in the peak of the summer and you're out at 2 o'clock in the morning, as a student, it's hard to beat.
And there your love affair began. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
You study Russian, you're at Penn, then you go straight from Penn to Harvard?
Yeah, so it was a bumpy road initially, because as are the expectations of many parents of young and aspiring suburban kids, I was supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer. And that just wasn't working out. So I had declared a major in biology. So I was going to read biology in British terms at Penn, and I was just doing miserably at it. I mean, I hated it, and it hated me. And so here was the language class, and there was the summer study, and I came back, and it was the summer before my third year of a 4-year university course, and I had an awful lot of catching up to do, and I jumped with both feet into the Russian and Soviet studies major and had an awful lot of ground to cover because I spent the first 2 years studying biology. So when I was done at Penn, I figured, you know what, I'm not done with this subject. And I went straight to graduate school just to keep going, to learn more about the history, the politics, the language, the economics, and how this mysterious sort of at once hostile and at once incredibly intriguing country ticked.
And of course, that is the subject of your book. Before we get on to the book, though, I want to cover your time as a journalist and also at Control Risks. So how did you get into journalism, and specifically the Miami Herald?
Yeah, so again, another sort of interesting story, and that is when I finished graduate school, I had 2 job offers. One was to go to work on the Soviet desk of a big New York bank, and the other was a summer internship at the Los Angeles Times on the editorial pages, writing leading articles, writing editorials for an 8-week summer in L.A. The banking job would have been interesting. It would have been incredibly lucrative, but it was a little bit scary. It involved an awful lot of numbers, and I've never, ever been very good at numbers in my life. The other thing is that I may have dodged a bullet. The job offer was with a bank called Irving Trust, which was an old, storied New York bank whose address was number 1 Wall Street. Shortly after I had the job offer, Irving Trust was bought by Bank of New York. Shortly after that, the Soviet desk and the Russian desk, this is a major scandal of the late 1990s in Russia, were all charged with money laundering in what became known as the Bank of New York scandal. And, it's hard to sort of say that this would have definitively happened, but it is entirely possible that had I accepted the job at Irving Trust, all of the people who were subsequently charged with criminal offenses might have been my colleagues. So we gave that a miss. And just for clarity, the Bank of New York itself was never charged. There was a sort of negotiated settlement between the Justice Department and the bank, and the world moved on. But I took the internship at the LA Times. And newspapering just also sort of grabbed me by the neck, and spent the summer writing editorials on the editorial page, speaking with the voice of the LA Times. And I'll never forget, the first thing I ever wrote was about this unusual new leader of the Soviet Union called Mikhail Gorbachev. And it was when he was appointed, and it was, introducing readers of the LA Times to who this individual was and what was going to happen to the Soviet Union as a result of his appointment. And somewhere gathering dust, I think, under my bed is a framed copy of that very first piece that I wrote for the LA Times, sort of cut out of the newspaper and framed. And it was called Gorbachev's New Strength, I think, was the headline. And it was just all about this mysterious new guy who wasn't Brezhnev, wasn't Andropov, wasn't Chernenko, and was supposed to have this transformative impact on the U.S.'s number 1 enemy.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, he did ultimately. So, Miami Herald.
Yeah. The thing about summer internships is that they very much end. And there wasn't. I mean, the L.A. Times is and was at the time, a massive American newspaper. And interns were meant to sort of have an interesting summer and get lots of experience and then leave. And I did. And so what you do in American journalism is you start very, very small with sort of local and regional newspapers and then sort of work your way back up to places like the LA Times. And so I left Los Angeles, drove across the country in a VW Rabbit, which I think is called the Golf over here. It was a used car that my dad had bought me years ago. He flew out to L.A. We jumped in the car. We packed all of my worldly possessions into the back of a VW Golf, essentially, and drove from Los Angeles to South Florida. And my first job was with actually a much, much smaller newspaper. I worked there for a year and a half. And when you're a Florida journalist, the dream is to get on with the Miami Herald. And so after sort of sharpening my teeth a little bit in local news, I applied for a job at the Miami Herald. They were kind enough to say, let's go. And it was, South Florida, Miami, journalism, the 80s, this was the late 80s, early 90s, was an extremely compelling place. Miami was a wonderful place to be young. I lived on South Beach. And the stories that boiling melting pot generated were just enormously compelling.
I mean, what a time to be in Florida. But of course, you didn't stay because your next big job was the Moscow Times in Moscow.
That's right. So something inside of me said, beaches and palm trees really wasn't the way to go anymore. And a friend of mine at the Herald who had a friend who worked at the Moscow Times. And she came up to me and she said, you know all this stuff about Russia, don't you? And I said, well, yeah, that's what I did in school. And she said, I have a friend who's leaving the Moscow Times, and he wants to come back to the United States, and you should apply for his job. And I did exactly that. And we just about almost swapped positions. He wound up working in San Francisco with Reuters, I think. And I moved in 1994 to the Moscow Times, showed up with sort of 2 suitcases and a backpack. And it was October. It was already, I think the first snow had already fallen. And, I had a down jacket and a pair of boots and a copy in my backpack of David Remnick's Lenin's Tomb, which is just one of these, David Remnick, who's now the editor-in-chief of The New Yorker, was at the time the Moscow bureau chief for The Washington Post, and he wrote the Bible on sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the start of the Russian Federation. And Lenin's Tomb was, you had to read it. And I brought it with me to Moscow, and I read it in my first few days on the ground there. And it kind of helped catch me up with what was going on as soon as I, got off the plane.
What was it like there at that time?
So it was an incredibly tumultuous time. And the one fairly vivid memory that I have is that Moscow was gripped at the time by hyperinflation. And literally when you would walk to work or walk towards the tube station, the metro station, to get to work in the morning, you would walk past these rows of kiosks. In 1994, Russia didn't really have supermarkets or grocery stores in the way that we would understand them. And what happened was these sort of these sort of tin can kiosks popped up everywhere around metro stations and one would sell milk and one would sell bread and one would sell vegetables. And I just remember, having come from Florida, I needed my orange juice every morning. And so on the way to work in the morning and on the way back from work in the morning, the prices would change on the groceries that you would pick up at the kiosks by the metro station. And so I always remembered to buy my orange juice on the way to work, because on the way back from work, it would be more expensive. The inflation was that rapidly escalating. Just the price tags that were written on pencil and paper were swapped out, every 6 hours or so.
Mm-hmm. So there you are. You've now got a front row seat, really, to what's happening with the economy and what's happening with business in Russia at the time, or in the Soviet Union at the time. At what point then do you decide that you're going to leave journalism and become a risk analyst?
Yeah, so there is an American expression that says that, the best journalists are people who have ink in their blood. And I think what happened at the Moscow Times, as much as I loved it there and miss it and worked with the most talented and generous people, I think I discovered at that point that I probably didn't have ink in my blood and that I was more a Russia person than a journalism person. And as exhilarating as those days were and being able to write about it, as exciting as that was, I found myself wanting to sort of dig in a little bit deeper and wanting to become actually a participant in what was happening in Russia, rather than solely, not to minimize the role, but rather than witnessing what was happening in Russia and being somebody who explained what was happening there. I sort of wanted to roll my sleeves up just one more notch and play a role in what was happening. And so, a lot of the skills that you had as a journalist combined with the educational background are transferable to the risk analysis business. This is about gathering information, as you do when you're a reporter. It's about analyzing that information, sorting out what is meaningful and separating from what is meaningless, and then being able to deliver this information in a manner and in a format that is digestible to an audience. And so in one sense, you're doing this for a newspaper reader. In the risk analysis capacity, you're doing this for a commercial client. But the projects were, longer, deeper, more engaging, and sort of more on the ground, if you will. Mm.
Now, a lot of people say that risk analysis is just civilian spying.
The Financial Times did a fantastic review of the book, and they called me a corporate spook. And I don't think I will ever sort of live that down. There is a certain amount of, the business has evolved over time. And one of the sort of jargony terms for it is intelligence. And intelligence can be a lot of different things. Intelligence is just information. And we were gathering information. And we're working in an opaque, initially, environment and having to do what we could to get that information. But, I wish I was a corporate spook. I wish it was that glamorous. This is a very heavily regulated industry, and we are held to incredibly high standards, not only by the law, but also by our clients who really don't want the spookery. They want reliable, verifiable, transparent information. And so from those early days of the kind of cloak and dagger image of it all, the industry moved on very, very quickly to becoming something that was ultimately mainstream and fairly vanilla.
I mean, so the questions they really want to ask are, should we invest here? Who's our competition? How best to go about this? What's our exit strategy? And so on. It's about doing business in sometimes tricky environments.
Exactly right. And so imagine in the 1990s, the world is globalizing. Companies are globalizing. And we have these things called emerging markets, which used to be basically third world countries, but had just been sort of rebranded. Third world countries are not investable. Emerging markets are very investable. And Russia was one of the biggest emerging markets in the 1990s. Companies had to go there. To not go to Russia in terms of shareholders and market and commercial opportunity, to not invest in Russia was almost seen as irresponsible because you'd be missing a huge opportunity. But everybody knew the politics were unstable. Early Russia was highly criminalized. I mean, there were literally people getting shot on the streets in Moscow, business people in business disputes. And so you can imagine these sort of publicly listed companies in New York and London and Paris and Frankfurt thinking, well, we've got to do business in this country, but it looks a bit terrifying from a distance. And so our role was essentially to sort of try to demystify Russia, to elucidate and enumerate the risks that it presented to companies who were really stampeding in, kind of almost no matter what. But, we were trying to help them do this as safely as possible.
And that, of course, is really what your book's about. Zero Sum, the subtitle is The Arc of International Business in Russia. You were there at the beginning, you saw those companies come in, and now you're seeing them go out. And you've written about all of that through wonderful, wonderful personal insights. You've done, hundreds of interviews with people, all meticulously documented at the back in a huge notes section. But it's incredibly readable. We have all these wonderful stories about people who came in, and you go right back. I mean, you go back hundreds of years, actually, to the very first foreign investments in Russia, and you bring it right up to date. Tell me, though, about that switch from sitting in an office advising people about it to deciding that you were going to write a book.
So you're absolutely right to say that there was a beginning and an end to this story. And, I was there at the Stampede inbound and was there at the Stampede towards the exit. And that, to me, completed a story arc. I mean, good stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, good books need a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think we finally, even though the end is extremely messy, I think we finally have that story arc in Russia. And, I had been at Control Risks for something like 26 years when this was all happening, and it's a great company, and I enjoyed it enormously. But, there's a time for everything. And the combination of having served a long tenure in a professional services firm and then having this story essentially drop on your head, really sort of the light bulb went off, and I said, this is a story that needs to be told. It needs to be told soon. It needs to be told quickly. And, I might be in a good position to hammer this out.
Mm-hmm. This is where I mentioned my own tiny role in this, because I was a bit naughty and a bit of a bully.
Georgina, I don't know whether to thank you or to blame you. Maybe a little bit of both, but primarily thanks and gratitude. And that is that I remember sitting in the kitchen early one morning getting ready to do a globalist broadcast with you. And I said, I think I have a book idea. And, as somebody who I respect enormously in book world, you endorsed it. And that was the green light that I needed. And then you very kindly just sort of nudged me in all of the right directions through your connections in book world. And, it took root. And it was really just sort of over the sort of slightly watery coffee in the Monocle kitchen that this whole thing took root.
Don't diss our coffee. I have a very particularly strong memory of sitting you next to a publisher at a dinner and saying, this is a publisher, Charles is writing a book. And you were like, I'm not sure that I am. But by the end of the meal, you'd given him your pitch. He was enthusiastic. And next thing I know, here I am sitting here interviewing you about this fantastic book. And I could not be more pleased. Charles, there's so much in this book. From really taking apart and explaining what globalization is, because that's so important, to how people have been blackmailed to stay within the country, how they've been forced to give their money over. I mean, there are layers upon layers upon layers. How are people exiting now?
Very badly, and with an enormous amount of financial, reputational, and sort of blood, sweat, and tears sacrifice. President Putin has made it extremely difficult for Western companies to leave Russia. Some companies have to leave because sanctions have made it impossible, indeed illegal, to do business in Russia. Others want to leave because they don't want to be doing business in a country that has been an aggressor state in a war. And, others are being told by external shareholders, get out of there. We don't want to buy things from companies that are doing business in Russia. The companies that left at the very outbreak of the full-scale invasion on Ukraine in February of 2022, the ones who left quickly left with the least damage to their finances and to their reputation. But just a few days before we're recording this podcast, Georgina, Carlsberg, the brewing giant, left Russia. They've been trying to get out of Russia for more than a year. They were nationalized. They were expropriated. And it looked for a moment like they were going to leave Russia with absolutely nothing to show for it. Zero. Heineken left Russia by selling its operations for €1. These were multi-billion-dollar operations in the country. Carlsberg owned Baltica Breweries, which was Russia's number one brewer. And, as a company that wanted to leave, in the end, it looked like they were being expelled from Russia. They sold Baltica for a certain sum of money, for hundreds of millions of euros. It is unsure how much of that money they're going to be able to take out. It is unsure how much of that money they're going to have to leave with the Russian government. It is a fraction of what the business is worth. And it is the end of a, years-long struggle to extract itself from the Russian business environment.
I mean, and you really make the point in the book that it was a gamble. It was always a gamble. And people went in knowing this. They went in knowing you're going to invest in this place. It's the Wild West. This is risk at its highest.
One of the things that I learned the most from in researching the book, and on the subject of the interviews, I think the timing was very good because a lot of people who were doing business in Russia had an awful lot to get off their chests. I mean, they really wanted to talk about their experience in going in, making tons of money, and getting out. But one of the themes that emerges from the books, and one of the things that was most interesting to explore, was this concept of risk and risk appetite. And companies that went into Russia had to have an enormous, in some cases, voracious appetite for risk. And some companies were sort of shoot first, ask questions later. Let's jump into the market with both feet and we'll see what happens. Others did it with sort of baby steps and tons of due diligence reports and tons of market studies and lots of, sort of political overviews. But everyone who went into Russia assumed potentially corporate, reputation ruining and company ruining levels of risk. And it was a sort of month by month, year by year, over this entire arc from the 1990s to just 2 years ago, it was this constant sort of calibrating of how much risk is too much risk and how is the sort of risk and benefit equation working out.
And I mean, it's tremendously poignant too. There are people who've spent their entire working adult lives there who were, expatriates, but who've been leaving Moscow with a suitcase on a train to Helsinki. I mean, it's very sad. Charles, it's a wonderful book. And it just, when you describe it, it sounds a little dry and you think, business in and out of Russia. Actually, it's so really well written, and it's got so many great stories in it, so many anecdotes, and it really made me understand how that worked. Although I have to say, I'm not sure anybody completely understands it, even you. Charles, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Meet the Writers. We talk so often on various other programmes, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about your book in this forum. I really, really encourage listeners to pick up a coffee. A coffee? A really bad Monocle coffee.
Sorry, I don't mean to diss the coffee because Lord knows I drink a lot of it.
And to be fair, it's very good in the cafe. It's only when I make it for you here at the station it's not great. Charles Hecker, thank you very much indeed. Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia is published by Hearst and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer, Steph Chungu, who also edits the show. And you can download this programme and previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.